Hi guys, this is Mike Hibbert back with another Python Django tutorial for you in this series. This time we're going to cover the subject of PayPal and how to set up Django so that you can actually do PayPal payments. Now we're going to use the Instant Payment Notification System, or IPN system, which is possibly the most simple one that you can set up. But this tutorial should give you the basic principles for you to go on to have a look at some of the other more detailed and more complicated parts of PayPal once you know how to actually get Django set up. So the first thing that we really need to do is, once we've created a brand new Django project, we need to install some modules. Now, in other tutorials you would have covered how to install things like Django itself, and now I'm going to show you something which is a little unusual. Now, what happens with the Django PayPal module is that it doesn't, or you can't download it through the pip installer, but you can, however, get it from Git or a Git repository. Now, pip actually has an option to let you install something from a Git repository, and then it will actually install it like a module inside of your virtual environment. And the way that we get that to install, if I just cut and paste in what it is that we're going to actually do, we'll just do the pip install section, but instead of putting the name of the package, we put git plus and then the actual address on the web where it is. Now on Git you'll get the option to have the SSH or the HTTPS version, and the HTTPS version is the one you're after. If you ever do this with other modules, then that works best. And what that'll do is it'll go and download the code, the source code, from that Git repository, and then it'll install it after converting it into a module that can be used along with our virtual environment. Once you've done that, then you're ready to set up. And one thing that you should note is that, unfortunately, with PayPal, there's absolutely no way possible to test instant payment notifications offline. So you're gonna have to be able to do this on a server. Now, if you've covered the EC2 deployment tutorial, then you'll have half an idea of how to set up a website online using Django, and that's probably the preferred way that you could do this, because you can probably run an EC2 instance for more or less for free. If you prefer to simplify it again, you can still use Heroku, but it still does mean that you're going to have to do a few bits of configuration for the Heroku's proc file, so you can get your application online. However, once you've set that up, you should be able to install your Django code no problem inside of a virtual environment in the very same way that you've done in the previous tutorials, and that'll get you enough set up here. This tutorial is simply going to cover what the details of the PayPal and used module is and how to use it. Actually getting you online is covered by those other videos. So once you're set up and you've got the relevant Django modules installed, which is just basically the Django framework itself and the Django -PayPal module, then you can go ahead and start altering the settings in your Django framework. Now the first setting we need to put in, just click in here, is obviously to add it to the installed apps. So we add paypal.standard.ipn, or instant payment notification, into the installed apps, and then finally we add PayPal receiver _mail, which equals the name of the business or the person that's going to receive the money in the PayPal transaction. Now, once that's done, that's enough to configure this for everything that we need. Now, the next section is just basically to set up our URLs so they'll work along with the PayPal instant notification system. Now, if you don't know how IPN works, in brief, and this is a very brief description, you basically send off a request to PayPal, it processes the request, And if the payment is actually successful, PayPal will call a URL on your website to pass back information that confirms that the payment was successful. So the way that works is basically to make it secure so that you are not the person that's kind of responsible for all the verification and all that sort of stuff. PayPal takes care of that, but then you still need to know that the transaction either happened or didn't happen. And if it was refused, you need to know that it was rejected. And if it was successful, you need that information too. So inside your website, you need some way of finding out. And the way that PayPal agreed to do that was basically by saying, if we have success or failure, we'll send a message to your website through a certain URL that we reserve specially for us, and then we'll pass that information back to there, and then whatever you do with it after that is up to you. Okay, so with that in mind, we need to set up some URLs, because the PayPal or the Django PayPal module comes with a built-in URL that handles all of that processing. So to add that in, we need to add something to our URLs file, which is basically this file here inside of a module called PayPal, because I said, or rather when I created this project, I called it PP or PayPal, and it's up to you, as long as you don't call it PayPal, because obviously that will collide with the name of this particular module that we're trying to import, and then you'll find you get all sorts of issues with it not being able to find the module standard.ipn. So don't call your project PayPal, whatever you do, and don't call any of your apps PayPal either, because that'll clobber the names and you'll have namespacing issues, which is why I had to do all of this craziness here. If you avoid doing that and call your project a good name, then you won't have any of those issues, and you won't have to spend hours and hours recoding, trying to wonder what on earth's gone wrong, when all it really boils down to is the fact that this starts with PayPal and you tried to name your project before that. But then again, you see, sometimes you just make mistakes. So learn from my mistakes. Don't name your project PayPal when you're importing a module called PayPal. Not sure why I made that mistake, because it's pretty obvious really when I think about it. So over in the URLs file, we need to import some URLs. The first one I'm going to set up is our home view, which just basically brings us through to our views file, and we're going to set up a home view here shortly. That's the first page you're going to see when we first come to the site. So if I just go back to here, you should see this first page. Now, as you can see, I've pointed my domain name through to the EC2 instance in this case. I changed the A record inside of there for to the IP address of my EC2 instance, and then it's propagated through, and now I'm able to use that as a proper website address. And you'll probably still be able to visit this once the tutorial is actually available to watch, because I'm not planning on taking it down after this. I thought I'd just leave it alone so you can look it over. Anyway, this is the first page, so this will be the home page. The next bit is that we're going to set up a page for handling things when the payment's been done successfully, and we're also going to set up a page for when the payment was cancelled. So if they get to PayPal and decide to cancel the whole thing but come back to the website, then we should provide them with a page to do that too. So the first one is the PayPal-return URL, and that's just going to push through to our PayPal_return function inside of our views file. The next one is the PayPal-cancel URL, and again that's just going to pass through to a PayPal_cancel view inside of our views.py file. The next one is more interesting, because this one is not going to point through to one of our views. It's going to point through to the view that actually deals with the instant payment notification messages that come back from PayPal. And I've chosen to call it a very hard to guess URL here. You can call this whatever you like. It might be a nice idea if you did something like a scrambled set of letters or something, you know, something that's not even a word, just to make this protectable, because unfortunately, because of the way that Django works, you can't necessarily do things like cross-site request forgery checking on this, and in fact if you try to, it'll fail because there's no actual code sent across from PayPal. They just post a load of information back to this URL, so we're actually going to have to do some code to make sure that this URL doesn't get checked. And also the PayPal return one, we're going to have to do the same there. Now, like I say, that can be anything you like, so you can set up whatever URL you need. However, when we get to the point where we're actually creating the actual payment button that you see here, we'll have to feed in what that URL will be, so that when it passes through this information about the payment and etc., it'll pass in where to actually send the user when they return from paying for the product, or where they'll go when it's cancelled. But we'll also pass through what the instant payment notification URL is, so that PayPal can send through the success or transaction rejected messages. So we've got this here. You name it whatever you like. We include PayPal standard IPN URLs, and then that will automatically hook up with the module, the Django PayPal module, and that will then be handled by the internal machinery there. So the next step is to start building our views. Now I've created already some base views, which is basically some HTML that pulls in the surrounding part of the page, which is just a header really, and some layout information. Then I've made a home page, which then actually just basically prints out the form for the button. Now, something to notice is that we just basically render in the form here, but normally when you do this, you would do render. Whoops. Good grief, typing's ridiculous today. Right, so normally you would do form render, and in this case that would render a form that was not a test form. So in the case of the example I'm going to show you, I'm going to be posting back to PayPal's sandbox system, so that we can actually see whether it's working or not. In normal production you would say form.render. In the case of us, because we're doing testing, we're saying form.sandbox, and that renders a different form with a different destination URL for testing only. When you come to put this live, you will need to change that back to the word render, and that's how we tell the difference between testing and live form for the PayPal payments. So something very important to remember, and if you're finding that payments are not going through but people have actually put their details in and it appears that it might have worked, then there's a chance you're probably still pointing at the sandbox. On our PayPal cancel, I've just basically put a title saying you've cancelled, and then also I've put two sections that put the post and get array from the actual URL into here, and they should be empty for the cancel. However, on the return, changed the title, but in the post and get arrays here, you may see different information. I'm very much pointing towards the post in this case, because the post array should have information about the returned transaction, and we'll see that at the end of the video when I demonstrate what happens. It should print out a query dict most specifically, and that should contain some information about the transaction so that we can check. However, there's more details of that later that I want to go through with you, but just to give you a quick overview of what the views actually look like, they're very simple. So let's set up our views in our views.py file just here inside of our main project. I'm going to import the render to response function as normal. This time I'm also going to import from Django Views Decorators CSRF, or cross-site request forgery. I'm going to import CSRF underscore exempt. Now what that does is it allows us to identify certain views that would receive information in the form of a posted form, but we deliberately ignore checking for CSRF in the Django framework. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because on our return view, the view that we get after the payment's done, we don't want to do CSRF checking because PayPal doesn't send us anything that we can check, and all we would get is an exception from the framework saying there's no CSRF checking here. This is obviously an attempt at some cross-site request forgery, but in our case it isn't, because we're expecting that to happen. So we're opting out of that checking so that we can continue with the process on the return path. The next thing we do is from PayPal standard forms, we import the PayPal payments form. Now this is a nice little form that basically will render our button for us, but also inject a lot of unseen things. So if I just go to the web page and inspect this here, we should see a form that's been created. It has an action which is currently pointing to the sandbox because we're using that sandbox method instead of render, but it has all sorts of other bits of information inside of here, including a reference to the image. And that's what that form class does. It renders all of that for us. All we really need to do is supply it with some values. So in our home page that we set up as the first page with the button on, I'm going to first of all create a PayPal dict, and then I'm going to fill it with some information. Now the first thing I'm filling it with is business, and I'm going to set that to the email address for who I want to take payment of. Now I know that we already set this email address in here, but this is one of these strange peculiarities of the module. I'm not entirely sure why. I've checked the docs on the site. It isn't immediately obvious why. It's just the case that if you don't put this in, it won't allow you to run the website. But later when you specify this, you can pretty much specify whatever you want. So put that in your settings, but I wouldn't necessarily take it as that being the de facto email address of who receives payments. You can change it here. Now the next section is just the amount, so I'll put 10.00. that is just in numbers, decimal numbers. The way that you actually specify what it is, whether it's euros or Great GBP or whether it's US dollars, whatever, is in the currency code section. So if this was USD, you put that there. In my case, GBP, you just look up the country code that they have on their site for whatever it is that you want to take payment for in whatever currency you fancy. Next we put the name of the item in, which is Mike's liver. So if you want to buy my liver, it's £10. Invoice. This is quite important because we can put a unique invoice identifier in here, and in our instant payment notification it will return that, so that we can tie that up with individual customers' unique invoices. So ideally what you would be doing is you would be creating an invoice inside your system especially for this, giving it a unique identifier and then putting it into this form at this point in the process. There you would mark the invoice as not currently paid, and then later when you do your instant payment notification, you would then basically go in and then with that unique identifier that's sent back to the IPN URL, you would then go and search in the database for that invoice and mark it as paid, and then that's the way you can personally kind of monitor the status of those things. Now we have the notify URL, which is just basically my website address with a very hard to guess URL tacked onto the end, which is what we set up just here, a very hard URL. And then the other one is the return URL, the website address name with PayPal-return as we've defined in here. That should be the end part of the URL, and the same for the cancel return. So we've set those pieces of information so that PayPal knows what to do in any eventuality. If this payment succeeds or fails, we send a notify to the notify URL. If the user returns from PayPal having done the payment and wants to come back to your website, this is the payment, this is the return URL where they'll come back to. And if they choose to cancel before the payment goes through or anything like that, then finally they'll be sent back to the cancel URL. Whatever you want to do with that is up to you, because some people don't have a cancel URL. Some people just say, right, I'll send them back to their normal page, or back to, I don't know, the front page of the website or their user profile page. It's entirely up to you what you want to do with that. Right, so the next part is to actually create a PayPal payments form, and we pass it in a value, an initial value, which is equal to the dict here, and that will initialize everything inside of that form, so that when it comes to be rendered on the HTML on our homepage, when we say form.sandbox, then it will output all the relevant values in the correct format, and thus it will create this form on the page. So we create the instance and put it into form, but then we pass form into the args dict that we created earlier, and then finally put that into render response for the template home.html, and that creates our button on that page there. Okay, now that's the bulk of the work done. The only thing we've got left now to do is define those two return and cancel URLs. So I'm going to do the return one, and we'll do that by first starting with the decorator that we imported earlier, just here. Just put that there, just above the function, so that we know that this doesn't require any CSRF checking, and it'll allow that through and not crash when PayPal returns us from that payments page. So as you can see, all I'm doing is I'm taking the post dictionary out of the request and putting it in as a post value, and the get from there, and then rendering to the template called PayPal_return.html. So as you remember, that just basically outputs the contents of what that is, so we can see what's been passed back to us. You could, in this case, take care of all your kind of return processes. So if you've got a customer, for instance, and you're just waiting to see whether they've paid or not, you can then check that in the response to this, check in the post. You'll be able to pull out that invoice unique identifier that'll be inside of the post array, as you'll see later on, and you could probably use that to do some searching in the databases, or at least to update some information. And then you can check on the IPN side of things whether that actually happened or not, which I'll show you just shortly. So there's our PayPal cancel, and it does more or less exactly the same, except it doesn't do CSRF check-in because we don't need to. There will be nothing posted back to this, so there isn't really much point in checking. It's just basically a demonstration of what it is that you get inside of there. So that's pretty much it. That's everything we need to do. So if we go to our site, we have this one button, and as you can see from the code, I've set it up with the payment of £10 GBP. So if we click that button, it should take us through to here. Now, this is our sandbox URL, as you can see from the top. So this is not live, this is purely for checking. This is the description on the price, etc. And I've set up in my PayPal developer console, I've created an account under the sandbox test accounts for paypal@mh.co.uk, and I'm going to use that as a dummy account to actually perform the payment. So as you can see from here, these are all just test accounts. I'll look at the profile for this. Funding, I've got a hefty amount of money, so I could probably just do as many transactions as I liked. However, I'm only charging £10 this time, so if I just type in the password, it'll now verify that email address under the payments section, and then if we just click pay now, your transaction was completed, and it says return to Mike Hibbert, or Mike at hibbertitsolutions.co.uk, and then it gives you the standard you will be redirected in 10 seconds or click here. So when I click here, it basically posts back to our return URL, as you can see, and this is the contents of what's been sent back. Nothing in the get array, or get dict rather, and all the information is in the post dict. So it's got things like protection eligibility, the last name of the person, the receiver's email address, the payment status is pending, the country of residence, etc. And where is it? Just looking for my unique ID. Here we are. So we've got the invoice that was returned, so we could probably use that to key into our database and look and find where that information is, or whether the IPN was called. Now if we go to the server, we're using Postgres on the server, so I'm going to log into Postgres, and then I'm going to use the PayPal database that I set up in there, and then I'm going to do a list. Yeah, that's definitely PayPal. So in there I'm going to do DT, I think it is, yeah. And as you can see, part of this whole setup thing when you set up your website online is that when you put it in, you're going to have to run SyncDB, and SyncDB will create all the normal authentication folders, tables rather, but it'll also create a PayPal _IPN table. Now if we look in there, we should find some information. So let's just do a quick select. PayPal IPN. Now you won't have to do this in your code. This is more or less me just giving you a rundown of what actually gets saved inside of the database, and you should be able to more or less crack this open. If you do a SyncDB on your local one and create a SQLite version, you should be able to see all these tables and have a good explore and see what's available. Now, okay, so we've got a section here called payer email. I think we'll also have invoice. So if I go back and we do, instead of select star, we go invoice. You can see there's already 3 unique ones where I tested it twice, and that last one is actually the one that we've just done now. We can also do payer email. There you go. So as you can see, all the information is in there for you to be able to pull back out again. And because it's now in the PayPal_IPN table, it'll have the status of whether it's succeeded or failed. Whereas when we did that return here, we still had the payment status. If I can just find it again, payment status at the time when this returned, it was still in the pending state. So this taking the return values as verbatim and being the success or fail is not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to check in the IPN table, and then if you check in there, you'll have the proper status. And that's pretty much how you do it. Basically, creating a form that gives the information about how to send and receive and what to do in terms of sending confirmations or rejections. Once you've done all of that, then you pass it through to PayPal. They do all the secure side of things and then give you some messages back just to see whether you were successful or not. Okay, well, that's the conclusion of this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in other tutorials in the future. Thanks.